Thank you very much, Mr. Howarth, and can I congratulate the honourable gentleman, the member for Selby and Ainsty, for the chair of the All-Party Music, PPG, for securing today's debate and for his opening remarks. And I think he covered a lot of the ground in his speech very, very well. And can I associate myself, too, with the remarks he made about the Bataclan attack in Paris. People getting together to enjoy each other's company, whether that be at a restaurant, at a football match, or at a music gig, represents the best of humanity. And people killing others whilst enjoying themselves for the sake of a twisted ideology represents the worst of humanity, Mr. Howarth. And we're here to celebrate the best of humanity today in terms of our musicians, the wonderful musicians we have in this country, and also to try and help them perhaps a little bit, and with the assistance of the Minister, to be able to pursue their profession, their career, their trade, their art with a bit more freedom and a few more opportunities to travel and play abroad. So I congratulate him for securing the debate, and can I also thank the others who've contributed so far, including my honourable friend, the member for Ealing Central and Acton, who in her Wikipedia entry she's described under occupation, it says writer, columnist, politician, senior lecturer and music DJ. And she didn't mention that, Mr. Howarth, in her contribution, but I'm sure we all look forward to witnessing that talent in practice at some time during the course of this Parliament. And can I also... She did actually also mention and sort of ponder on what will be the eventual contribution of Wham's famous tour of the People's Republic of China on Chinese history. I think perhaps the answer to that, Mr. Howarth, is exactly the same as the one that Zhou Enlai gave when he was asked what influence the French Revolution would have on history. It's too early to tell, but we'll eventually, no doubt, find out what contribution Wham did make to Chinese history. I will give way. Yes.
Thank you very much indeed. I think the significant contribution of that tour, which may have been preceded by Elton John, I'm not sure of my chronology, was a surge in bleached mullets across China, which became very popular, if I remember the period that the honourable gentleman refers to.
Is it any wonder, Mr. Howarth, that we are condemned for Western imperialism from time to time by those in the Far East? Can I also congratulate the honourable lady, the member for East Kilbride, Strathaven and Lesmahago for her contribution, and she said she was tone deaf, but I thought she hit exactly the right note with her contribution, and she does have colleagues who are very musically talented, including the member for Perth and North Perthshire, who she knows plays in the legendary parliamentary rock band MP4, along with me, and colleagues from other parts of the House. Now, moving on to our points of discussion today, the honourable gentleman outlined very well the sorts of contribution, as other honourable members have, that the music industry makes to our economy and in particular to our export revenue, and at a time when our balance of payments is in significant deficit, it's a very positive contribution that the music industry makes. And there's always a danger, and I think this was referred to by my honourable friend, of double counting, and it depends what you count as the music industry in these matters. But I think the figure from UK Music of 2 billion, around that sort of figure, is a credible one, and nearly $1 billion of that comes from the work of musicians, composers and songwriters and lyricists in revenue from overseas in terms of foreign currency, but also a significant amount estimated at £42 million by UK music from foreign currency gained through live performances. So it is a significant part of our economic strength, but it's also obviously a very significant part of our cultural strength and the soft power of the democracy of the music industry's contribution to promoting democracy and freedom and our cultural values across the world is highly significant and shouldn't be underestimated. And so I think there have been some very welcome developments in recent years in relation to that, Mr. Howarth, and I would include in that the Music Export Growth Scheme, which the government introduced in the last Parliament in order to support musicians through grants, developing musicians to be able to go and tour and play overseas. That's very welcome. But of course, it's not welcome that perhaps those sorts of musicians who are gaining support either from a scheme like this or possibly through arts councils and other schemes across the UK are then being denied the opportunity sometimes to tour or being prevented or being subject to excessive financial costs from touring overseas. And there has been a particular focus, I think, recently on the issue of musicians touring in the USA because of a number of cases that have been highlighted. And I want to say, first of all, that I am, extremely pro-USA, a big fan of American music. I have an American wife. I first went to America with my guitar, and I wasn't stopped at customs when I was 19 years old and managed to get in at that time. That was a lot longer than that. It was a long, long time ago. And I think that the cultural exchange, in particular in relation to music, between the United Kingdom and the United States is one of the great cultural jewels of the world, really, and the tremendous cross-fertilization that there's been over many, many decades of music between the United Kingdom in both directions and America is a wonderful and marvellous thing and should be cherished, developed and taken on and supported by the government. But I do want to highlight a couple of cases in the hope that it'll lead to better procedures in future because there have been some worrying cases recently. One of the cases, I think, being referred to by the Honourable Gentleman was the case of Kizzy Crawford. Now, he didn't mention here, she's a very young singer from Wales, who in fact has played here at the House of Commons. One of my other roles, Mr Howarth, is to chair the all-party parliamentary group on the folk arts, and Kizzy came here and played at one of our little showcases that we have from time to time in the Jubilee Room, just next door to our chamber here last year. And she is a wonderful young talent and someone who has a bright future, I'm sure, in the music industry and the potential to become, in the future, quite a big star. She's a tremendously talented young woman. When she went on a visit to the US last year, or earlier this year, having been invited to participate in a showcase in Kansas City, and she travelled to Canada first to do some gigs before moving on to the United States. All was going well. She even cleared Mr Howarth US Customs at Toronto in pre-clearance to go through to the United States on one day, only for their flight, unfortunately, to be cancelled, and she had to return with her manager and her musicians back to the hotel and spend the night there and return for when the flight was to take off the very next day. And then on that occasion, as they were going through clearing US Customs, she was pulled aside into secondary, as I believe it's called, where she was questioned. Now, bearing in mind this is a young girl who I think I'm right in saying at the time was 18 years old, a young girl from Wales, embarking out on her musical career, but really not somebody who, would be very well equipped to deal with being heavily questioned in those sorts of circumstances and pulled aside away from her support mechanism of her manager on her first, visit to America as a musician and so on. It was quite a traumatic experience for her, and understandably, I'm the father of a 21-year-old daughter. Understandably, she was frightened by that and panicked a little bit and had a little bit of a panic attack, as a result of which, in the locked room, she was detained for several hours and then eventually refused entry to the United States, where she was supposed to be going to Kansas City to play this showcase, despite having funding from the Welsh Arts Council to go on this visit, despite having all the correct paperwork and visa and so on. And it was a pretty traumatic experience for her. And she was also told, obviously, that this could have a major influence on her ability to visit the United States as a musician again in the future, and that automatically, as a result of this kind of refusal of entry on the border in future, she would have to obtain a visa for every visit that she made to the United States, and that was an automatic part of the process. Now, I and others, and I want to at this point praise UK Music and their Chief Executive Joe Dipple for the work that they do in this area, and also the Musicians' Union, and declare an interest as a member of the Musicians' Union, and under their General Secretary, John Smith, and their Assistant General Secretary, Horace Trowbridge, who do tremendous work in this sort of area. As a result of this, there was a degree of lobbying that went on. And I, amongst others, also got in contact with the US Embassy about this. And I suppose it's fair to say that probably the same might be true in the UK. You probably wouldn't, if you wrote to the Home Office about particular cases, we know this as MPs, you don't always get a very fulsome and helpful response from the Home Office about individual cases of refusal of entry and so on. But I think it's fair to say that it seemed to me that there's a degree of difference between the attitude taken by the State Department and the Department for Homeland Security in relation to this. Kizzy had been issued with all the right documents by the State Department through the embassy to go to the USA and to play in this showcase. And, you know, there should really have not been a problem. But because of the separation between that process and the Department for Homeland Security, which understandably has to protect the USA's borders and do its job and so on, but it did seem to me that one wonders why she was pulled aside in the way she was, whether there was any racial profiling going on, I don't know, in this particular case. But it did seem to me that she was singled out for pretty harsh treatment for a young musician simply travelling to the USA for that reason. And it does, and it is concerning that there seems to be this disparity between the attitude of the State Department and the Department for Homeland Security. I don't think it's deliberate. But I think it's not a coincidence that this isn't an isolated incident. And the Honourable Gentleman also mentioned the another case involving the band Callan, also from Wales, who also encountered great difficulty when they were seeking to enter the United States. At first, there was a bureaucratic problem in relation to the computers at the US Embassy, which affected everybody, in fairness, at that time, but was a bit of a nuisance. But subsequent to that, they did everything they could to get the right clearance and paperwork and visas to be able to fulfill their engagements in the United States. Unfortunately, even though they toured not as a whole band because two of their members at first couldn't gain entry, subsequently they ran into problems again, even though they thought they cleared the fact that they had the right paperwork. And if I can quote from an email that their manager sent to me, he said, "Our issue might not be with the embassy, but rather Homeland Security. Callan travelled in what they thought was the correct way, but my main issue is the way they were treated. And although there might not have been the right stamp in their passport, they paid for a visa and had a copy of the approval notice, etc. Not in letting them into the country was a little overzealous, I feel. They sat around for about 7 hours, then had their laces removed along with their belts and put into a cell with other people with a toilet with no door. Then the next day they were escorted to a caged van and taken to the plane. The atmosphere in the holding room was extremely unpleasant, with guards being incredibly rude and impatient." So we're not talking about, there is more, yes. He says, "I understand that they have to treat everyone in the same way, but to treat them in the same way as criminals was uncalled for. It was a one-off incident. Then, if it was a one-off incident, then it might be unfortunate, but other musicians have travelled to the USA for perfectly valid reasons and have been turned away and treated badly." So I think what I'm saying, Mr. Howarth, is that I would hope that today's debate would open up a dialogue between the government and the US Embassy here. And we know and we've heard of the support that the US Ambassador gives to music, and I know he's a tremendous music fan himself, and I attended the Rock the House event at the US Ambassador's residence earlier this year, and he was incredibly generous to give that facility over to allow young people the opportunity to play music. But unfortunately, that very, very positive example that he's setting is being let down a little bit by what happens when people get over the other side of the Atlantic. Now, just in conclusion, as well as opening up that positive dialogue, I think it would be helpful, and I know there are moves to have more pre-clearance for people travelling to the United States here in the UK. It is currently possible to pre-clear immigration in Ireland if you're travelling to the United States, and I know there are plans for more of that to happen in the UK, and I don't know if the Minister knows anything about that, but does he think that that would be a positive contribution to trying to solve this problem? And the UK music, in addition to the issues that have already been raised, have also raised the issue of A1 national insurance forms for employees going overseas for 2 years or less. musicians have been having difficulties apparently with getting these forms from HMRC, and the UK Music would like the government to consider what it can do with HMRC to speed up that process. And also the problem musicians have with flying musical equipment to the United States, when, in order to do so, a band has to have an approved US company with a business premises and a federal tax ID and a previous shipment history, which restricts options to fly their equipment as cargo within the USA, because equipment can only be moved by cargo plane and they operate between a minimum number of cities, less frequency, and are very much more expensive. So that's also another additional problem. So I look forward to the Minister's response to the debate, and I hope he's able to say something positive about the steps that he's taking with the government. As the Honourable Gentleman said, this is a cross-party initiative, I think, here today. We all are here for the same reason, because we love British music and we want the rest of the world to love it too. And the only way that can happen is if our musicians are able to travel freely, and hopefully today's debate can contribute towards that.